Half a century of the Metropolitan Police addressing its failings.
Sir Robert Mark said that when he took over at the Met, there was institutionalised wrongdoing, blindness, arrogance and prejudice on a scale he'd never experienced in 30 years of policing.
Well, the targets, I have to say, are absurd. You can only have a target for recruitment and retention, because otherwise you'd be firing a lot of white men. I mean, it just doesn't make sense.
I had no reason to doubt the original investigation into phone hacking. With hindsight, I wish we had judged some matters involved in this affair differently.
We have zero tolerance of racism, and we will deal with people very firmly. I don't want anybody who's sexist in my organisation.
And now this.
Lifting the stone and revealing painful truths will not be resolved overnight.
The latest report says the Met is institutionally racist, sexist and homophobic, with a boys' club culture failing women and children. Now, Channel 4 News spent some time with one of David Carrick's victims. She told us, "I can't get back to who I was before. That one night changed the whole course of my life." So, with her in mind, if these changes don't happen within the time frame you've set out, who do you think should be held accountable? Because some would say, conveniently, Mark Rowley will have finished his term.
Her rapist essentially had at least 9 occasions where, if they put it together, they could have worked out that he was doing what he was doing. And it took one woman to come forward, not the Met. You know, what's so terrible about this is that he would still to this day, in my view, be continuing to rape and abuse women if one of those victims hadn't come forward to set the ball rolling on getting him brought to justice and locked up in prison. So I think the stakes are really high, and that's why I'm asking the Met not to be defensive, to think about women like that, to realise they've got to put their house in order, and that we go back pretty quickly, i.e. don't leave it 5 years, to satisfy ourselves that the Met is moving. And I think the Commissioner and the Deputy Commissioner welcome that.
The Casey Review lays out the facts. Officers, 82% white, 71% male. Budget, 18% smaller. Stations, 126 shut in 12 years. And public trust, down from 89% in 2016 to 66% last March. And then launches into its excoriating conclusions. Inadequate management, predatory and unacceptable behaviour with too many places for people to hide, defensiveness and denial, and a bullying culture. The problems take up one chapter after the next. The report outlines humiliating initiation rituals and high numbers of female probationers leaving. Patricia Fenton was in the force for 26 years and describes similar incidents on first starting out.
It was really bad. When I started the service, 1994, I was a probationer. I actually had some thoughts about, have I joined the right service? An operator on night duty where the driver is driving at speed. We're going about 80 miles an hour at speed. I've got this map book. I've got to find this address. I'm new, and he called me a soppy whore. He kept saying, "Come on, you soppy whore," because he would like put his foot down on the pedal. He would just stop abruptly. And I found out 5 years later, after I left the borough, he actually said to me at a function, he tried to make me vomit as an initiation, as a new member of staff.
7,000 Met personnel were surveyed for the Casey Review, and it's revealed grim experiences. Initiations like people being urinated on in the shower. A Muslim officer found bacon left in his boots. Gay women asked questions like, "What percentage gay are you? And are you up for a threesome?" And a female officer asked, "Who did you have to f*** or suck to get that job?" Patricia was part of the Diplomatic Protection Group in the early 2000s. It's now known as Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection, the unit David Carrick and Wayne Couzens were in.
Basically, as a woman, you were like a fish in shark-infested waters. I was sitting in night duty, reading a magazine, and I remember they were all laughing. When I looked up, there was porn on the TV.
Do you remember how you felt in that moment?
You feel degraded. They knew I was from the National Black Police Association, and they felt that I was a plant. It's like they thought I was up there for some dark reason, you know. I'm going to bring to light some of the inappropriate behaviours.
Baroness Casey has suggested disbanding parliamentary and diplomatic protection to create a new identity and ethos. It's one of multiple recommendations. In fact, she uses the term initiative-itis in the report to describe the flurry of programmes that the Met has recently introduced, which some staff members feel are more about perception and optics than they are about real change.
I accept her diagnosis about the racism, misogyny and homophobia in the organisation, and also that we have these systemic failings, management failings and cultural failings. I understand her use of the term institutional. It's not a term I use myself. I'm a practical police officer. I have to use language that's unambiguous and is apolitical. And that term means lots of different things to different people and has become politicised in recent debate over the last decade or so. I've spoken publicly about the various reviews, revetting and pieces of work we're doing. It's very clear to me already, even within a few months, we're sacking more people and we're getting more intelligence from our good frontline men and women.
And on language, the Home Secretary has made her position clear.
On the topic of institutional racism, Mr. Speaker, I agree with Sir Mark Rowley. It's not a helpful term to use.
The term was first applied to the Met 25 years ago, a finding of the Macpherson report after the racist murder of Stephen Lawrence. Are you confident that Mark Rowley is the right person to lead the Met forward?
I do feel confident, both in the Met Commissioner and the new Deputy Commissioner, that they are a step change. They're not in denial. They're not rubbishing what anybody says to them, and they are much more open.
So how to fix the Met? Recommendations include a dedicated women's protection service, a complete reset of the use of stop and search, and independent experts in permanent roles to advise on culture change. 2 years tops, says Baroness Casey.
Well, I'm sorry to say we can't put any of this to the Metropolitan Police Commissioner, Sir Mark Rowley. We asked for an interview, but it was refused. Earlier, I spoke to Chief Superintendent Harvey Katka from the Police Superintendents Association and Steve Hartzell from the Police Federation, who represent rank-and-file officers. And I began by asking Steve Hartzell whether he accepted Louise Casey's damning diagnosis of the Met.
Yes, I do, and I think you'd have to be ill-advised not to accept the findings and look at what's actually been said, because it is very damning. Obviously, the report's taken a long time to get to the decisions made by Baroness Casey, and we have to look at it. We have to do some soul-searching, look at where we can make improvements, change the culture of policing, because we want to give our colleagues, but also the public, some satisfaction that we can get confidence back in policing.
The Metropolitan Police Commissioner is very clear that this is not about bad apples. It's systemic, it's about management, it's about processes. Do you also accept all of those things?
Yes, we do, and as the Federation of England and Wales, we've been asking for proper training, direction. We need correct managing, we need leadership, we need those in charge to sort of set in very high standards which we can all adhere to, because then you get the top-down effect that if we see leaders leading policing properly, speaking up for members and giving us proper training, proper terms and conditions, then everybody can fall in behind that and know exactly where they stand.
So are you prepared to accept the term institutional racism? If you accept it's systemic and all of those things, do you accept institutional?
I think if you look at institutional, I'd be potentially saying that every single one of the members that I represent, the 145,000 potentially, as being institutionally racist, sexist, homophobic, and that isn't the case. There are structural issues within policing, certainly in the Metropolitan Police, that need to be fixed. If institutional is the right word that the report says, then I would accept what the report's saying, but not every one of my members is racist, sexist, homophobic. Right. That would be unjust and unfair.
Chief Superintendent, let me come to you then, because, I mean, just to be clear about the definition of institutional racism, misogyny, any other problem, as defined in the report and by Macpherson before it, is the collective failure of an organisation to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their colour, culture or ethnic origin. It can be seen or detected in processes, attitudes and behaviour which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness and racist stereotyping, which disadvantage minority ethnic people. That's not saying everybody's a racist. Do you accept institutional racism, misogyny and homophobia is within the police force?
So I would say that we do have people within policing, sadly, who have racist views and misogynistic views and behaviours. And I would also add to that, that if we look at all of our processes, so that would be from recruitment, vetting, through to internal misconduct processes and equally criminal cases, are all of those processes fair? And I would say evidence already suggests that there is a disproportionate impact on people from Black and Asian backgrounds. So those processes do need to be reviewed.
Yeah, well, much more than reviewed, according to this report. I mean, if this is a problem of leadership, as the report says, as Steve Hartzell says, isn't it your members, it's at chief superintendent level, where there is real problems, because your members are not creating the cultures in their teams that is required?
I think when you look at all of these issues, and I will go on to the membership and the role that we as senior leaders have in making sure that we set the right tone and culture and standards, but we also create the right culture that allows all officers of rank and file to be able to have that psychological safety, to be able to talk truth to power, and that when victims come forward, we believe them, we give them the support that they require, and throughout the process, whether that's an internal misconduct inquiry or criminal matters.
It's hard to imagine a report that could be more damning than this. And this is about the culture of your members really not blowing the whistle on each other enough, not creating a culture amongst themselves that is safe for each other and for the general public. I mean, shouldn't all your members now go through retraining and revetting?
Yes, we've been asking for training from my colleagues now for plenty of years, because nationally there probably isn't a mandated training package for every officer to do. Certainly on the case report, I guarantee there's been officers out there patrolling, dealing, investigating crime today that perhaps haven't been made aware there's a report. They should have been. So we're asking for protected learning time for our colleagues across the country to have meaningful conversations with themselves, with senior leaders in policing, to engage with the public, because that's the only way you can learn. We need an educated workforce. They absolutely do need training to understand the impact, but also to know how they can challenge that inappropriate behaviour, to do it properly.
And revetting, would you support that?
Absolutely. I don't think you'll find a decent, hard-working police officer that doesn't want their colleagues revetted to make sure they are of the highest standard possible. And indeed, with the current data process that are taking place, every officer is being subject to Police National Computer Database surveys to make sure that they are beyond reproach, that if they've got a criminal conviction or a caution, that's been brought to the attention of senior ranking officers, so decisions can be made about their processes, about whether they stay or leave the organisation. So there's a lot taking place, but it must be done properly and professionally to make sure that my colleagues, but also more in public, you the public, can have confidence that it's been done correctly and it's done regularly to make sure that these things never happen again.
Do you blame the public for not having trust in the police at the moment?
No, I don't. I think it's very hard that if you are watching the news, listening to mainstream media, it's very hard not to feel completely disillusioned by the police service. However, I was in a meeting earlier today and we touched on the number of calls that come into policing every single day. The public are still calling police for support, but I fully accept that large portions of society feel completely disaffected with the service they've had, and that's very disappointing. And, you know, apology to go out to the victims that haven't had the correct response to crime. They should have done, but we've got to all now get behind this report, understand where we need to change to give confidence back to the public.
Chief Superintendent Harvey Katka and Steve Hartzell, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, let's talk now to Abimbola Johnson. She's a barrister and chair of the Independent Scrutiny and Oversight Board, set up to oversee the police's plan to tackle racism. Also joining me is Anna Burley, co-founder of the Women's Safety Campaign group Reclaim These Streets. Abimbola Johnson, the Commissioner doesn't want to use the term institutional racism, nor does the Home Secretary, nor, it would appear, do those officers we heard from just there. Does that matter?
It does matter. Identifying an issue, diagnosing it is really important, and the discomfort that they express around using the terminology of institutional racism, I think it shows that the understanding of this in policing is still in its infancy. You heard there from the head of the Police Federation that he was reluctant to call it what it was because he didn't want every officer to be labelled a racist, a homophobe or a misogynist, and that's not what the label means. So I think that there needs to be a real period of reflection and consideration of what Baroness Casey is talking about in her report. The reason that she concluded that the Met is institutionally racist, for example, is because of 4 factors. The fact that there are overt racists who wear the Metropolitan Police uniform, the fact that there are officers and staff of colour who experience racism, that there is systemic racism in policing, and finally the fact that they underprotect and they over-police communities of colour. So those 4 factors are the reason that she came to that conclusion. When you go back to the Macpherson definition from the Stephen Lawrence Inquiry report, you see that those failures still exist there as well. It's not about labelling every single officer racist, but it is about identifying that the response to eradicating racism and these other issues needs to be institutional.
Anna Burley, Baroness Casey, also said that the force was institutionally misogynist. Do you agree that that matters, that it's accepted by the force, by the Commissioner, by the Home Secretary?
Absolutely. If you can't name a problem, it's very difficult to fix it. And I think I really take offence at the idea that it's too politicised a term to be helpful. What I think it is it's uncomfortable for them to admit, not unhelpful, but they need to accept that there is an institutional problem, that women and girls not only don't receive the priority they ought to, broken fridges containing rape kits in a heatwave, it just isn't good enough, but also that there are behaviours and cultures which discriminate against women and make women unsafe.
And those behaviours and cultures were internal in terms of, as we've heard, to female colleagues, and then bled out to how they treated women who came forward for their help.
Well, absolutely, and sort of the third category being the partners of police officers, and we've heard a lot about instances of domestic abuse that are not being dealt with properly, where victims don't feel able to report because their partner has a warrant card. It's, when you have people with those attitudes in an organisation where those behaviours and those actions aren't challenged, and not only are there no repercussions, but you can be promoted despite numerous reports about your behaviour sitting on a shelf somewhere, then there's a problem.
Abimbola Johnson, one of the really interesting observations in the report is that black Londoners have had really low levels of trust and confidence in the Met. 4 years, it's simply been ignored, and it's only now that other groups have started to criticise the Met that it's garnering such attention. Do you expect any change in the damning assessment of the way black Londoners are policed as of this moment?
I think time will tell. I think, even the premise of the Casey report is interesting, right? We've seen these trends in terms of the trust and confidence that black Londoners have had in the police for decades, like you say. But it took the horrific murder of Sarah Everard, a white woman, to get the senior leadership in the Metropolitan Police to even ask for this review to be held in the first place. And it's because of the Casey Review's tenacity and their hard work that they've looked at this through an intersectional lens, that they were asked to look at misogyny. Baroness Casey even said herself, she thinks that the police thought what would happen is they'd bring her in, she'd pat them on the back, she'd say, oh, you're doing some really great work, I can see the improvement, and that would be it. But instead, she's put them under a microscope and she's identified that these issues are intertwined, that people who share those characteristics have been saying this for a very long time. It's not new to them. We talk about the major reports that hit the headlines, Scarman, Stephen Lawrence Inquiry report, the David Lammy review. But between those reports, there have been others. There have been grassroots interventions, there have been campaigns, there have been protests from people raising time and time again that these trends exist in policing.
Anna Burley, Baroness Casey seems to have confidence in Mark Rowley, the Commissioner, to carry out the change that's needed. He did have responsibility for the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Command, where both Wayne Couzens and David Carrick worked. it was described as really toxic, a dark corner of the force, and yet today, when he was asked about that level of toxicity, he said, I didn't see it. Does that leave you unnerved?
Absolutely unnerved, and I think that is a big part of the problem is leadership in the police have seen these issues. It's their own staff who have been perpetrating against colleagues, it's their own staff who have been making complaints about behaviour, and it's the leadership that make their way up the ranks that have looked the other way or have condoned that behaviour or perhaps are a product of it.
Going to have to leave it there. Sorry, would love to talk to you more on this, but thanks very much for joining us this evening.